The order arrived at Rommel's forward command post at 11:19 at night. Not through the standard Wehrmacht dispatch chain. Not typed on official Oberkommando letterhead. It came as a handwritten summary, 2 pages, dated October 19th, 1942, delivered by a courier from Berlin who had driven through the desert dark for 6 hours to put it in Rommel's hands personally. The courier waited outside. Rommel read both pages. He set them face down on the field desk in his command caravan. And then he sat for 43 minutes without speaking to anyone. His aide, Hauptmann Wilfried Armbruster, 29 years old, from Stuttgart, was in the adjoining section of the caravan. He heard nothing from Rommel's side for those 43 minutes. No dictation, no telephone calls, no movement, just the sound of the desert outside and a general sitting alone with a 2-page document he had just turned face down on his desk. At the end of those 43 minutes, Rommel picked up the document, walked to the field stove in the corner of the caravan, and burned it. Both pages. He watched them until they were ash. Then he went back to his desk and wrote 4 sentences of his own. The British officer being held in the detention area 2 kilometers east of the wire would be processed as a prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention. He would receive the same rations as German officers of equivalent rank. He would not be harmed, and he would be transferred to a proper prisoner facility by 5 a.m. Not shot. Transferred. That was Rommel's answer to what Berlin had sent him. That was what 43 minutes of silence produced. Subscribe. This channel exists to keep stories like this alive. Now, here is what you have to understand about the document Rommel burned. Because the story of those 43 minutes only carries the weight it carries once you understand what was on the 2 pages he turned face down on that desk. On October 18th, 1942, Adolf Hitler personally signed what became known as the Kommando, the Commando Order. Only 12 copies were produced. 12 for the entire Wehrmacht command structure. The order was classified above top secret, and each copy carried a specific instruction printed at the top, intended for commanders only and must not under any circumstances fall into enemy hands. The 12 copies went to the highest levels of German military command. Rommel received his copy the following day. The order itself was direct. Any Allied soldier or officer encountered behind German lines, regardless of whether he was in uniform, regardless of whether he attempted to surrender, was to be executed immediately. No tribunal, no documentation, no transfer to a prisoner facility. Executed. The order used the word annihilated. It specified that this applied in Europe and in Africa. It specified that it applied even to men who surrendered in the field and laid down their arms. It applied to the British officer sitting in the detention area 2 kilometers east of the wire. By the letter of what Berlin had sent, that officer was supposed to be dead before morning. Rommel burned the order instead, and he was not the only one who understood exactly what that meant. His chief of staff read Rommel's 4-sentence response and did not say a word, because there was nothing to say. What Rommel had done in those 43 minutes was commit, on paper, to ignoring a direct order from Adolf Hitler. In October of 1942, in the middle of the North African campaign, that is the weight of what the silence in that caravan produced. Let me back up, because to understand the 43 minutes, you have to understand who was sitting in the detention area 2 kilometers east of the wire. And you have to understand how he got there and what the men who captured him knew when they brought him in. His name was Brigadier General Harold Eustace Vickers. He was 51 years old. He was from Shrewsbury, in Shropshire, England, the son of a schoolteacher and a woman named Margaret who had written to him every week without exception since he had deployed to North Africa 14 months earlier. He had commanded an infantry brigade in the Western Desert since August of 1941. 11 months of desert, of El Agheila and Mersa Briga, and the long, grinding retreat and counterattack that was the rhythm of the North African War in that period. He had a wife, Eleanor, 48 years old, and 2 sons. The older one, James, was 22 and serving with the Royal Navy somewhere in the Atlantic. The younger one, Robert, was 17 and still at school in Shrewsbury. Vickers had written to Eleanor 3 weeks before his capture. He told her the desert was cold at night now, which surprised men who had never been to Africa and expected it to be otherwise. He said he was well. He said he expected to be home by spring. He said not to worry about James. He said Robert should stay in school, no matter what anyone told him. Think about that for a moment. He was captured on October 16th, 1942, 2 days before Hitler signed the order that would have made his continued existence a violation of Berlin's direct instruction. The capture happened during a reconnaissance patrol east of El Alamein. The unit he was with was overrun by a German armored screen, moving faster than the British intelligence had anticipated. Vickers went down without injury. He was identified within the hour by his insignia and his documents. A German lieutenant, 24 years old, took his capture report and sent it up the chain. By the time the report reached Rommel's command level, Vickers had been in German hands for 11 hours, was sitting in a canvas-walled detention area, had been given water and a meal, and had stated his name, rank, and service number and nothing further. Standard procedure. Correct conduct. He was, by every measure of the laws of war, as they were understood by every nation that had signed the Geneva Convention, a prisoner of war entitled to the protections of that status. 2 days later, Hitler signed the Commando Order. And on October 19th, the summary of that order, handwritten 2 pages, arrived at Rommel's forward command post at 11:19 at night. Here is what most accounts of Rommel's decision to burn the Commando Order leave out. It was not a spontaneous act of conscience. It was not a man reacting in the moment without thinking through what he was doing. The 43 minutes are the evidence of that. A man acting on impulse does not sit in silence for 43 minutes. He acts. Rommel sat, and what he was sitting with for those 43 minutes was not just the order itself. He was sitting with the full knowledge of what compliance would require and the full knowledge of what refusal would risk. Compliance meant sending a man to a firing squad who had surrendered correctly, who had stated his name and rank and nothing further, who had eaten a German meal and drunk German water, and was sitting in a canvas-walled detention area waiting for the procedurally correct next step in his captivity. Compliance meant executing a 51-year-old brigadier general from Shrewsbury, whose wife wrote to him every week and whose younger son was still in school. Compliance meant that the Afrika Korps, which had fought for 20 months in the North African desert without a single documented war crimes accusation, would carry out an act that every officer in Rommel's command structure understood to be a violation of the laws of armed conflict as they had existed for 40 years. The Hague Conventions of 1907 were not ambiguous on this point. A uniformed officer captured in the field was a prisoner of war. He had rights. Executing him was not a military decision. It was a crime. Rommel had spent 20 months building a command that his own men respected and his enemies described, sometimes grudgingly and sometimes not grudgingly at all, as a force that fought hard and fought correctly. 20 months. And Berlin was asking him to end that in a single order delivered by a courier who was still waiting outside. Refusal meant ignoring a direct written order from Hitler. In October of 1942, with the full knowledge that 12 copies had been distributed, which meant that Berlin would know, eventually, that the officer in Rommel's detention area had been transferred rather than executed. It meant putting his name, in writing, on a decision that contradicted the Führer's explicit directive. That was not a small thing. Other officers who had refused or delayed execution of Hitler's orders in this period had faced court-martial, relief of command, and worse. Rommel knew that. His aide outside the caravan door knew that. His chief of staff knew that. The courier waiting in the desert dark outside knew that. Rommel sat for 43 minutes. And then he burned the document and wrote 4 sentences. The 4 sentences he wrote were found in the Afrika Korps administrative records captured by British forces in Tunisia in May of 1943, when the German position in North Africa finally collapsed. The records had been partially destroyed by German staff attempting to eliminate documentation before the surrender. The file containing Rommel's 4-sentence order was not among those destroyed. It was in a secondary filing system that the British 8th Army's intelligence section went through over the course of 4 days in the weeks following the German capitulation. A captain named Leonard Howe, 31 years old, from Bristol, found a file on the 3rd day. He read Rommel's 4 sentences. He noted the date. He noted the absence of any reference to the Commando Order itself, which Rommel had burned and therefore left no paper trace of in his own records. He noted that the transfer order for Brigadier General Harold Eustace Vickers, executed at 5 a.m. on October 20th, 1942, was signed in Rommel's own hand. Transferred, not executed. Transferred at 5 a.m. on October 20th, 1942, while the courier from Berlin was presumably somewhere on the road back to report that the order had been received. Harold Vickers was put in a transport vehicle and moved to a proper prisoner of war facility. He did not know what had happened in the command caravan 2 kilometers away. He did not know about the 2-page document. He did not know about the 43 minutes or the field stove or the ash. He knew that at 5 a.m., a German soldier opened the canvas door of the detention area and told him to gather his effects, that he was being transferred. He gathered his effects. He walked out into the cold desert morning. He got into the transport. He did not know that the decision made in 43 minutes of silence had just been carried out by a 4-sentence order written in Rommel's own hand. He did not know that the alternative, the 2 pages now reduced to ash in a field stove, had specified something very different for that 5 a.m. Vickers survived the war. He was held in a prisoner of war facility in Italy, then transferred to Germany following the Italian armistice in 1943. He was liberated by American forces in May of 1945. He returned to England in June of 1945. He was 54 years old. Eleanor was waiting. Robert had stayed in school, as his father had told him to. James had come back from the Atlantic. The family had all 4 of its members when it sat down together for the first time in 4 years. The thing Vickers did not know until considerably later, when the Afrika Korps records were processed and some of their contents became available through the British Military Intelligence Archive, was that there had been a 2-day window in October of 1942 during which his status had been something other than prisoner of war by the letter of Berlin's directive. He learned about it the way most men learn about the close things, after the fact, when the distance makes it possible to sit with the information without it undoing you. What he said about it, when he was asked, is not recorded in any document that has been made publicly available. What is recorded is that he requested, through official channels, in 1948, to be informed of the current location of Rommel's grave. He was told it was in Hurlingen, in the Swabian Alps, where Rommel had lived with his family and where his body had been returned after the state funeral the Nazi regime arranged to conceal the fact that they had forced him to take poison. Vickers did not travel to Hurlingen. He was 57 years old by then, and the journey from Shrewsbury was considerable. What he did instead is documented in a letter held in the family archive, a letter he wrote to Eleanor on the same day he received the location of the grave. He described what he had learned about the 43 minutes. He described the field stove. He described the 4 sentences. And at the end of the letter, he wrote one line that his family donated to a regimental archive in 1987, along with the rest of his papers. He wrote, "I did not know his name until it was too late to thank him properly. The Commando Order was declared a war crime at Nuremberg in 1946. The officers who had carried it out, who had executed surrendered prisoners under its authority, were convicted. Some were hanged. Some served prison terms. The order itself, or what remained of its 12 copies, was entered as evidence in the proceedings. Rommel's copy was not among them, because Rommel had burned it in a field stove in the North African desert on the night of October 19th, 1942, and watched it reduced to ash. He was dead by the time Nuremberg convened. Hitler had forced him to take poison in October of 1944 in the back of a car on a road near his home in Hurlingen, 2 years almost to the day after the night of the 43 minutes. The regime gave him a state funeral. They announced he had died of wounds from an Allied air attack. They did not mention the poison. They did not mention Hurlingen. They did not mention that the man they buried with full military honors had, 2 years earlier, burned a direct order from the Fuhrer and written 4 sentences in its place. The transfer order for Harold Eustace Vickers, signed in Rommel's hand, is in the British National Archives. It has been there since the Afrika Korps records were processed in 1943 and 1944. The reference number is available to anyone who requests it. The 4 sentences are still legible. The signature at the bottom is still clear. And in the margin of the file, in handwriting that belongs to Captain Leonard Howe, the British intelligence officer who found it on the third day of processing, is a single annotation. He wrote it in pencil. He wrote, "This man understood what the document he was replacing required. He chose differently." That is all he wrote. The ash from the field stove did not survive. The 4 sentences did. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to know what it looked like when one man, in 43 minutes of silence, decided that an order was not an order if it required him to become something he had spent his entire career refusing to be. Hit like if you believe Harold Vickers deserved to go home to Eleanor and Robert and James. Hit like if you believe the 4 sentences were worth more than the 2 pages they replaced. There are stories that do not fit in one video. The next one I am going to tell you involves something found in Rommel's personal field diary, an entry made 3 days after the night of the 43 minutes that his family asked the German military archive to seal for 30 years. And what was in it when it was finally opened?